And we have not done that in Darfur. We haven't put forward a development program yet. Even our diplomats, unfortunately, are trained to speak only in war and peace terms. They're not trained in developmental terms. Hunger does not jump out at them. They're professionals at violence, at managing violence, perhaps the best of them. But they're not necessarily jumping to the deeper causes of hunger, disease, lack of adequate water. And I would say that this is really the most reliable way in. Now, what's happened in Africa is that there's been a lot of peace agreements. Mozambique, Angola, Sierra Leone, Liberia, northern Uganda, southern Sudan. And yet we don't respond to consolidate them. And there's still a lot of violence, of course, in Somalia, in western Sudan. And the way out of that, in my opinion, I don't mean to be so simple-minded about it, but we have to always give the hope of development solutions to real people's real problems as part of how we're going to induce an end to conflict.
The Darfur situation is a kind of case study for us today, I think, from different points of view. I mean, it does raise the question of how to even dampen down the enormous violence at the present time. If you were asked for a list of priorities of how to proceed based on the work you've done, what would you advise either the Security Council or the United States executive and legislative branch about the steps, starting from where we are to where we need to get to?
Well, I've given the list, even though I've not been asked. That's my general strategy, which sometimes people don't appreciate. But my view is that we have to put a development framework on the table. And we have to go to Bashir al-Bashir, who's head of the government, and say, look, let's find a way, and to the combatants, and say, we understand at a start that this is a fight among impoverished people for whom there's not enough to go around. And we don't want to just talk about sanctioning you, and we don't want to just put this as us versus the Khartoum government. And we actually want to find a way that is a little less blame and a little bit more problem solving. This is not to exonerate government behaving badly, but it is to say that the route of sanctions and pounding the table and demanding the military solution will not work. And I've said that for the last 3 years, that it's just, and this is not my core expertise, so they can come back to me and say, you don't know what you're talking about, but I've said to the people engaged in this process, you're not on the right track. It's not going to work. I have spoken with Chinese leadership, I've spoken with Libyans, I've spoken with others who actually do believe that there is a development approach to this and a face-saving approach and a less confrontational approach. And I would try something different. Maybe I'm naive and wrong, but I can tell you just an odd example. I was with one of our leading diplomats last month in Washington at an event of the Congressional Black Caucus, and she said that one of the things that prevented one of the rebel groups from signing on to the peace accord, which is more or less a dead letter it seems right now, but anyway, from even signing it, was that they felt what's called the compensation fund, which was the peace fund, was too small. Well, how big was the compensation fund? That is, to help decommissioning combatants and so on. $40 million for a region of 7 million people. Now, can you really think you're going to get peace at $5 per capita in a place without water, food supply, facing global climate change, and where there's no infrastructure and the like? Of course not. So that rebel group was absolutely right. How could the U.S. dare to go forward with a compensation fund of $40 million? That's nothing in the scheme of things. I don't know how many minutes of Pentagon spending it is, but it ain't very many. And if we really want to solve the problems, we have to understand the real life of people in Darfur. And it's not just about war. The war came for a real reason. Perhaps, it's about the poorest place on the whole planet.
I think I may have run over here. I think I'm supposed to turn this back to Father McElroy for questions, and I'm sorry if I let this run on longer than I should have, even though it's a delight to talk to Jeff Sachs, whether you're on television or not.
It's a delight for all of us that it went over. I just want to pose some of the questions that have come from participants in the conference. All of them reflect themes that were enmeshed in many questions. The first one, which I'd say was the theme most often voiced in the questions, and I would ask both of you this question. The question is, I get it. Now what can I personally do to make progress happen?
The first thing I would say is become personally aware. Learn about the Millennium Development Goals. Learn about a malaria bed net. Make an individual contribution, as I've said, and get your friends and families, school, church, community engaged. When you get a moment, send an email to your congressman or senator saying, what are we doing? Not taking this seriously. This is dangerous for us. And create a web of growing, a network of growing commitment and growing interest. Sign on to the One campaign. That's an easy email for you to do. Look at Millennium Promise, which tries to provide some answers that can be helpful for you. But most of all, get engaged. Make it part of your daily life. Doesn't have to be a huge part. 0.7 of 1% will be an important step forward. What we need to do in this country is make this part of what our country, our society stands for broadly. It's going to happen. It needs to happen. It will happen. As much as you individually can do to accelerate that, that I would say is really the most important. Create those ripples so that the engagement becomes a spreading and mighty wave.
I think the one thing I would say to sort of just contextualize that is the importance of what this conference is about. In other words, the Catholic Church is the largest single religious community in the United States. And one of the questions we always have to ask ourselves is, what does our moral vision stand for? In other words, when people hear the word Catholic, what do they think we're identified with? What do we think is important as American citizens who are also Catholic? So we're obviously in the midst of elections that will lead to other elections. Discussion of this in the public arena by the church, I think, is very important, precisely because this dimension doesn't get discussed enough. We are going to talk about the war. There's no question about that. But that's one piece of international security. This is a different piece. So I just think what you're doing is to identify this as on the agenda of the church in the United States, so that we're trying to help the United States be a more positive actor in this arena. I think that's the one thing that this conference highlights.
Professor Sachs, what do you mean when you say that dire poverty can be eliminated in the world during the next 10 or 15 years, that it is possible to do that?
What I mean is that the extreme poverty, which I define as poverty that kills, people that do not have enough to eat, people that do not have access to safe drinking water, people that do not have access to the basic preventative and curative public health